Hello, my name is Daryl Robert Chun, and today I'm going to talk about the subject is all roads lead to the Federal Reserve and 9/11. Now, I know that's not true, generally speaking, but in the instances that I'm going to tell today, they are true, and they're specifically true. For those of you who have watched these programs of late, I'm going to recapitulate some of what I've told on those programs and bring them together in a different way. I had spoken before of a book I wrote in 2006 called Light in a Dark Place. This is the second edition of that book, 2012 edition, and it's called Light in a Dark Place, The Prison Years by Daryl Robert Chun, forward by Marshall Thurber. Now, that book was published in 2006 when Martha and I were attending Marshall's Positive Deviant Network, and we decided to put a collection of my writings together from that period of life in which, as I say, it was my monastery years, not by my choice, but I did make the best of it. And it was a collection of my writings. And in that book, in that 2006 edition, was a very interesting story. And it was a story of how I met Howard Hughes's former private banker, Dr. Norman Bernard Therian. And as I said in that book, the chances of Dr. Therian and I meeting on the outside were not great. We ran in very different circles. Before working for Howard Hughes, Norman had worked for Daniel K. Ludwig, the richest man in the world, the richest when Forbes magazine came out with his Fortune 500 for the first time. Daniel K. Ludwig was number one on that list. He was above Howard Hughes. Norman worked first for Ludwig, then he went to work with Howard Hughes, and then he went to work with Adnan Khashoggi, all in the capacity of a private banker. How he came to be in prison in 1986, when our paths crossed, was the story that he told me there. Now, my world was very different than Norman's. As I say in the book, I had dropped out of law school in the Haight-Ashbury, went to the Haight-Ashbury, and had the life of a hippie, and along the way, I had presidential invitations. It wasn't the usual life. I had gone to, I was on Dianne Feinstein China Committee, a number of things, and I was arrested in 1985 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, whereupon in 1986, in the fall, our paths crossed. And because of those paths, I heard a story that Norman told me that I knew that he had told few others. And Norman was in prison. I didn't ask him why. I found out later what it was, and it had to do with the story that he told me. And Norman said that he had an appeal pending, and he thought he was going to get out of prison. And when it got turned down in the spring of '87, he took me aside, and Norman knew that I wrote back then, even then. And he said, listen, Daryl, he said, I'm going to tell you a story, but I want you to keep it hidden from anybody else. I want you to put that story in safekeeping, which I did. Norman proceeded to tell me a story and show me some papers. And that story is in this book, Light in a Dark Place. The papers he gave me are in here. And I'm sure these are papers that the people who printed them, who issued them, never intended them to see the light of day, especially the ones in the Reagan White House. This first one here is a letter from Transglobal Productions. It's, let me see, I can bring it up on here, I think. Let me see. There it is. Okay. This is the letter Transglobal Productions. It was a letter written to Lord Viscount Cranborne, Viscount Lord Cranborne in London, introducing Norman Therian to Lord Cranborne. The chairman of the Transglobal Productions Limited was none other than General Robert E. Cushman. Cushman was, Norman pointed out, was former deputy director of the CIA and former commandant of the United States Marine Corps. The story Norman told me was quite extraordinary. In 1983, Norman said he'd been approached by representatives of Transglobal Productions, ostensibly a movie production company, in actuality a covert CIA front. Now, whether it was an official CIA front or it was a CIA front because it was covert, I don't know. But nonetheless, it was covert. And these people approached Norman and asked for his help in soliciting money from the Saudi royal family to support the Afghan resistance. Now, this was the period in which the Russians had invaded Afghanistan. And that's when the United States began supporting the Mujahideen, which included people like Osama bin Laden and other Afghani fundamentalists who were fighting Russian oppression. They knew that Norman had very close connections to the Saudi royal family because of his connections with Adnan Khashoggi and the circles he moved in. He was a private banker at the top of his game, international private banker. He lived in Europe and lived in the United States at the time. And Norman said yes. He went to the Saudis as instructed and asked for the money, and they gave it to him. And it was headed for the Afghan resistance movement. Now, I asked Norman this. I said, why did they ask you to ask the Saudis, Norman? These were people, General Cushman was at he had access to he was in Reagan's White House, inner circles, National Security Council, NSC. I mean, this was the White House. William Wilson, also involved in this, was part of the Reagan inner circle. He was Reagan's envoy to the Holy See in Rome. I said these men with one phone call could have gotten that money from the Saudis. Why did they approach you to do it? And why did they approach you through a front, through a company called Transglobal Productions, ostensibly a movie production company, to approach the Saudis? Norman didn't have an answer. All he knew was what had happened and what he had done. And I thought about it. And what it appeared to me, because of what happened later, was that this was an attempt by Reagan White House insiders to skim funds that they were raising from the Saudis for the Afghanis. That if they believed that if they had done this as public servants, it would be illegal. But the Reagan White House was a great believer in privatization. Privatization, what a wonderful concept. And they believed that as private citizens, if they raised the money through a private company, using a private banker to do so, they could then take fees from these monies, and it wouldn't be a violation of law. I want to assure you, they were wrong. It was a violation of law. But nonetheless, they did do it, and Norman raised the money. Nobody knew about it. This was a covert operation, all right? Nobody knew about it. It wasn't in the newspapers or anything like that. And what had happened is that Norman, General Cushman, and I tell the story in this book. This is in the first edition of the book, Light in a Dark Place. That General Cushman had confided in Norman that they were going to take some of the money that they had raised from the Saudis, and with this money buy captured Syrian arms, Russian arms, that the Israelis had captured during the Six-Day War. These arms were brand new. The Syrians just dumped them as the Israelis chased them back into Syria. And the Israelis had these in warehouses. And so they were going to buy these arms and sell them to the Afghan army with the Saudi money. Norman lost his temper at this time because the Saudis were his connection. He had brought them into the deal. He knew the Saudi royal family, and Norman felt that if the Saudis found out what they had done with the money, the $500 million they had raised from them to help the Afghan resistance, they wouldn't look kindly on what Norman had done. So he lost his temper with General Cushman. General Cushman assured Norman, now that he knew about this, that he wouldn't do it. And he promised Norman that they wouldn't do this. Well, the truth of the matter is, they did do it. He kicked Norman out of the deal, and he knew Norman wouldn't go down easily. Norman's fee was 2% of the monies raised. $500 million was raised by Norman from the Saudis. 2% is $10 million. And so Norman started raising a ruckus about what had happened to him. And shortly thereafter that, within a year, Norman was arrested in Monaco, extradited back to the United States, and forthwith sentenced to 4 years in federal prison on charges of receiving illegal loan fees. Norman felt, and he told me that these were trumped up charges, all right, that he felt he was in prison because of they wanted to shut him up. And so he gave me these papers. I wrote them down, blah, 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 and I'm in prison, 1987. I heard the story, I wrote it down, and I kept it in safekeeping. Now, what I want to tell you is this. I didn't know whether Norman's story was true or not. I mean, a man tells you he's Howard Hughes' banker. Yeah, he could be. He was very honest. I like Norman, an older man, rather conservative, not prone to speaking loudly about himself, all right? And so the story he had told me about this $500 million, of course it's not in the newspapers, until I read in 1987 that the Iran-Contra funds had been discovered in a secret CIA Swiss bank account, all right? And in that bank account, the funds from Iran-Contra had been commingled with $500 million of U.S. Saudi funds meant for the Afghan resistance. I was stunned. Why? Because this was the first confirmation that Norman's story, other than what Norman told me, was actually true. Now, that was 1987. That article also said that the CIA Swiss bank account was in the name of an Israeli-Swiss businessman named Bruce Rappaport. All right? I remember that name because of the story Norman told me. I had no other reason to take note of that name, Bruce Rappaport. But rest assured, I remembered it because last year, in September 2011, I read an article on the web on a site called Veterans Today. And that site talked about a Reagan covert operative named Lee Wanta, and his involvement in a multi-billion-dollar financial transaction designed to take down and buy up the assets of Russia that eventually ended up, this is what the article said, with the destruction of the Twin Towers on 9/11. The article said that the crimes that happened on 9/11 were designed to cover up the financial fraud that had happened of $250 billion worth of covertly issued bonds. And that the attacks on the World Trade Center were highly targeted. They weren't just the work of some Muslim terrorists. And it said that 31% of the fatalities at the World Trade Center were suffered by two bond firms, Cantor Fitzgerald and Eurobonds. I knew that Cantor Fitzgerald had suffered those casualties because I do a lot of reading. Most of my work is in the area of finance, and I'm very familiar with Cantor Fitzgerald and their prominence in the field of bond trading. All right, and they said at the Pentagon, there's 41% of the casualties of the World Trade Center were the two bond traders, and 41% of the casualties at the Pentagon were at the Office of Naval Intelligence, which had been conducting an ongoing investigation into those bonds. The article also said that shortly after, during this time, the SEC for the first time suspended all reporting regulations for the first time, that they would allow securities to be cleared, sold, and transferred without record. All right? And the article said this was done even though no backup systems ever went down. All the backup systems were intact, all right, of the financial institutions. And yet the SEC, for the first time in its history, suspended all reporting transactions, allowing $250 billion worth of covertly issued bonds to be cleared through the financial system. What this article said was most of the financial irregularities were centered at a bank called the Bank of New York. The bank owned by an Israeli-Swiss businessman named Bruce Rappaport. When I saw this, I remembered that Bruce Rappaport was the gentleman in whose bank account the Iran-Contra funds were allegedly discovered in 1987. That here, in 2011, his bank, the Bank of New York, was at the center of financial irregularities surrounding 9/11. I'm reading this article now with a lot more interest because of the name Bruce Rappaport. And the article said that it appeared that at the center of these financial irregularities was the Bank of New York and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which cleared the securities, all right, during this time. It said unknown persons at these two banks were at the center of what had happened. Now, because of the story told to me by Norman Therian in 1986, 1987, about Transglobal Productions, about a $500 million Saudi fund that nobody else had heard about until I saw it in the newspaper, corroborated with his bank account in the under the control of an Israeli-Swiss businessman named Bruce Rappaport, who later would be pointed out as the owner of the bank. There were two banks, Bank of New York and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Owner of one of the two banks at the center of these massive financial irregularities that happened during 9/11. So the story of Bruce Rappaport led directly, eventually, to 9/11. Now, that's one story. For those of you who've been watching my program, I think the last program that I put up on YouTube was entitled "The 1%, Fear, and the Democratic Process." And in that program, I talked about how the elites control the democratic process in America. All right? I talked about change. That those who don't want the system to change because they have a vested interest in the status quo, worth massive amounts of money, power and wealth, don't want the system to change because they're in control. Now, I asked the question, how do these elites stay in control where you have a democratic process? And in that program, I talked about how they did it. And I said basically the 1% scares the 99%, splits them down the middle, and at least half of that eventually gets so scared of change that they vote against all change. All right? They think they're voting against the social change. What they're really doing is they're voting against all change and the financial interests that control primarily first the Republican Party, and lately, because of Bill Clinton, they now control the Democrats. They have legislation that puts them in the catbird seat in control of America's financial and political destiny. So that's how the 1% stays in power. Now, I use the example of a man emblematic of the 1%. If you go back and watch that program, it's on my Schoenworks channel. I suggest you look at it for historical reference, even though it's only 1 week old probably at this time. It's called The 1%, Fear, and the Democratic Process. But in that video, I talked about a man named Pete Peterson. Peter G. Peterson is his real name. And I talked about how I had come by that name and how I came by I known him. Now, the truth is, how I became familiar with the name Bruce Rappaport is quite unusual. And I've just told you that story. I mean, you weren't there. You weren't talking to Norman Therian in prison. You didn't hear him tell you the story of how he was involved in this covert front to raise $500 billion from the Saudis. And you weren't there when I read the newspaper in prison in 1987 and saw the name Bruce Rappaport attached to this bank account. And I, last year, exactly a year ago at this time on Veterans Today, read another article about the financial transactions irregularities surrounding 9/11 and the name Bruce Rappaport being mentioned. That is a rather convoluted process. But I think you can understand why I would remember that name and see its significance when it came up about 9/11. Last week on my YouTube channel, I told the story of how I heard about the man named Peter G. Peterson. All right? I had not known about him before around 3 years ago, probably 2008. I would say 2008. I heard about the name because I had written my book, Time of the Vulture: How to Survive the Crisis and Prosper in the Process. And in that book, I had predicted that a massive economic collapse crisis was going to face the United States and the world. That we were headed for a repeat of the Great Depression, blah 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 blah. That real estate would lose 40 to 70% of its value, and other predictions such as that. Many of my predictions turned out to be true within the next 2 years. And so I was interviewed on a radio station, and the host was a man named Chuck Harder. And I think on the first show, Chuck asked me if I had ever heard of a gentleman named Pete Peterson. And I said no. He said, Darrell, I'm going to have you on the program again. I want you to look this man up. So I went and I Googled this man, Pete Peterson, all right? And you could do the same. And I found out this was quite a significant person. He had gone to graduated Northwestern, I think he got his master's in business from University of Chicago. At one time attended MIT. Eventually goes to New York and ends up chairman of Lehman Brothers, one of the top Wall Street banks on Wall Street. Lehman's was the one that collapsed in 2008 when the financial carnage happened on Wall Street. But Pete Peterson was the CEO of Lehman's from the early 70s, I think, until the mid 80s, when he resigned Lehman's and his position as CEO at Lehman's, and formed a company called Blackstone Partners. Blackstone was the big boys version of Bain Capital. Bain Capital is sort of famous because it's a private equity firm. I think Mitt Romney was one of the founders, and they made a lot of money basically flipping U.S. corporations, stripping them of their assets, indebting them, and selling them, and that's what private equity firms do. Well, Pete Peterson's Blackstone makes Bain Capital look like a minor league franchise. He started that company with a gentleman named Steven Schwartzman in 1985, and in 2007, I believe, maybe 8, they went public. And for his share, not all of his share, he sold part of his share. Pete Peterson received $1.9 billion. All right? In 2008, his net worth was estimated to be $2.8 billion. And where is it here? I think he was listed, he was probably 134th or something in Forbes' wealthiest people in the world, or in the United States. I don't know what chart he's on, but $2.8 billion is a lot of money. All right? And so Pete Peterson had contacted Chuck Harder and asked him a question. And here's Chuck Harder. He's got this radio program, and he gets a call out of the blue from one of America's most powerful people. I mean, Pete Peterson not only was a chairman of Blackstone Partners and past CEO of Lehman Brothers, he was also formerly chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is one of the most powerful political organizations in the United States. So this man was at the apex of power in this country. All right? And Chuck told me that he had been on the cover of the Wall Street Journal in, I think, 96 or 97, and they were making fun of him because he was warning of a financial catastrophe, and he had this little American flag they put on him, and he got a phone call unexpectedly from Pete Peterson, and Mr. Peterson, one of a very, very wealthy man at the center of power in this country, asked him a question. He said, "You know, Chuck," he said, I live in a gated community, and I'm worried that if eventually I could get a phone call or a letter with the ear of somebody I know." And I was discussing how I had met, came by the name of Pete Peterson. I was being interviewed on a radio program by Chuck Harder in 2008, And he asked me if I knew who Pete Peterson was, and I didn't. And I did some checking up on this man, found out that Mr. Peterson was one of those powerful men in America. He had a net worth of $2.8 billion in 2008. He had been former CEO of Lehman Brothers. He was a partner in Blackstone Partners, one of the most successful private equity firms in the United States, a billionaire, a man of tremendous power, tremendous power. And that's how I found out who Pete Peterson was, because of my conversation with Chuck Harder. Mr. Peterson had called it Mr. Harder, and he said, listen, I'm worried. I mean, obviously, he said, I live in a gated community, but I'm worried that someday I may receive a threatening letter and somebody has kidnapped my grandchildren. What could I do about it? Chuck Harder was sort of surprised at this question from this man, but he said, well, Mr. Peterson, maybe you should try and make sure that do something so people wouldn't get that mad, that people who are that dispossessed wouldn't take it out on you because you possess so much. Well, his conversation with Chuck Harder ended. Chuck's conversation with Mr. Peterson went by the wayside, and in 2008, Chuck asked me if I had ever heard the name Pete Peterson, and I hadn't. But I want to tell you, as I was doing research, further research on 9/11 and on my TV program that I was going to discuss power in the United States and in the democratic process, I went and did some more research on Pete Peterson. And only recently did I find out that not only was he the former CEO of Lehman Brothers and partner in probably America's most successful private equity firm, Blackstone Partners, and a billionaire and former chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, but Pete Peterson was also the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York on 9/11. Now, when I was telling the story of 9/11 and the financial irregularities that happened, probably over $250 billion of covertly issued securities were cleared, evidently, secretly, by the SEC through the Federal Reserve Bank in the week after 9/11. I had showed you on a previous program the account balances, FedWire funds, aggregate balances, the week from September 10th to the 21st. And on September 11th, the balances were in the usual, and before then were in the 10 to 13, $14 billion range. The day after 9/11, they went up to 46 billion. The day after, they were over 100 billion. Over 100 billion again, and over 100 billion again. The next day, they dropped down to in the 40 billions, and 2 days later, they're back to normal. So right after 9/11, you had 5 days of distorted imbalances at the Fed. All right? The Wall Street Journal had written an article, and it said suspicious activities had been taking place centered at the Bank of New York shortly after 9/11. This is what the Wall Street Journal said. Now, I have pointed out that the owner of the Bank of New York was Bruce Rappaport, all right, who, because of my own life, I had found out that the Iran-Contra funds had been found in his bank account in 1987 in a Swiss bank that he controlled. Bruce Rappaport was a banker, all right? Not only did he control the Intermaritime Bank in Geneva, which is allegedly also a CIA front, he also controlled various other banks, influenced them. His own bank, the Bank of New York, was the center of a massive money laundering investigation by the FBI in 1999. No one went to jail except a very low-level clerk. Millions of dollars went through it, and basically they weren't touched. All right? Now, what the article that I ran across that tied Bruce Rappaport to 9/11 also said was this, that at the center of the events around 9/11 were two banks, and people at those two banks were involved. Unknown persons, all right? The Bank of New York and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the branch, all right? For those of you who don't know, the Federal Reserve is a is like an octopus. The head is headed by Ben Bernanke right now. It used to be headed by Alan Greenspan, but you have branches of the Federal Reserve. You have a branch in San Francisco, you have a very famous branch in St. Louis, you have one in Dallas, you have one in Philadelphia, you have a few branches of the Federal Reserve all over the country, all right? But there is a branch in New York, and the article about 9/11 said that was the branch that was involved with these financial irregularities, that of which the Bank of New York was the other counterparty too. Now, what I have just told you is that in the last month, only in the last month, did I find out that Pete Peterson was chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York during that period of time. That's why I'm saying all roads lead to the Federal Reserve and 9/11. And as I said, that statement is not true except in these two instances. These are two very different roads. Roads that are not connected at all, except perhaps by my awareness that these two roads even existed. In this book, in my first edition, I told the story of Norman Therian's involvement in this $500 million Saudi fund that had happened. A covert CIA, whether it was really an official CIA operation, I don't know. All I do know, it was covert, all right, handled in a covert manner, headed by a former deputy director of the CIA. Okay, there are many things that happened that are not officially CIA, and certainly the CIA isn't going to tell you anyway. Their denial is almost proof positive that they were involved. All right? I mean, after all, it is the CIA. Okay? So I told that story in my book that I published in 2006. I had no idea, and I didn't even put Bruce Rappaport's name in it because I considered it incidental. It had nothing to do with Norman's story. Only because Norman told me that story in 1987 did I realize when I read the newspaper that confirmed the existence of the $500 million that Norman had raised from the Saudis by its being in the same bank account as the Iran-Contra money under the control of an Israeli-Swiss businessman named Bruce Rappaport, did I see a connection. That was the very connection that last year alerted me to the involvement of Bruce Rappaport in 9/11. Subsequent to that, that's when I began focusing on 9/11. Now, I am not telling you anything that's not true. I am merely telling you something that I'm sure you don't know. Now, the truth is, you don't know it because they don't want you to know it. The truth is, I know it only because of a very bizarre set of circumstances, which I told you. I happened to be a friend of Norman Therian when his case was turned down. Norman happened to know. I wrote. We happened to be friends. He asked for a personal favor. I had a 10-year prison sentence. I had nothing better to do. Plus, I do like politics, all right? Not the voting part of it, but the power part. I write down Norman's story. I'm the only one he's told his story to, all right? And nothing eventually happens. But 20 years later, I put this in a book, and we publish it. So there it is, 2006, the complete story of Norman Therian, the documents that Norman gave me, the documents from Cushman, blah, 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 blah. You know, I know it's true. You can... I'm not trying to convince anybody, all right? But this is how it is. So the book is published 2006, not this book. This is the second edition that was published last month. Why did I republish this book last month? Because I added an additional chapter. And in that chapter, in the last part of this book, the book stays the same as my 2006 edition, all right? But in the last part of the book, I have a chapter called 9/11, Gold, Money, and Power. And in that chapter, I talk about how the name Bruce Rappaport connects to Norman Therian, connected to 9/11, and connected to various and sundry individuals like his sidekick, Dr. Alfred Hartman, who is connected to the Rothschilds. It's all in there. It's just all in there. If you have no interest, fine. But it's there. You can Google. You can Google Collateral Damage. It's up on the web. It's free. You can watch the movie Zero. It was a movie on 9/11. It ties some of these elements together, but not the element that I'm talking about, the financial element, just more questions about 9/11. And that's how I know Bruce Rappaport was involved with the events around 9/11, which also involved the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That's one of the roads that I'm talking about. The other road is the road that I just recounted to you, how I was introduced to the name of Pete Peterson by my being interviewed on a radio show in 2008, doing some research on Pete Peterson, finding out who he was, all right? But only recently finding out, after I found out that the counterparty to Bruce Rappaport's bank in the shenanigans around 9/11 was the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It was only in the last month that I found out that Peter G. Peterson was chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York during 9/11. And the alleged parties that were involved in this washing of $250 billion of a covert operation involved probably, certainly Bruce Rappaport, and most likely Peter G. Peterson. Now, if you go up and Google Peter G. Peterson, he's head of the Peterson Institute. He's talking about fiscal responsibility. We have to stop spending. And he is absolutely right. We have to stop spending like fools. And we're going to. But I know it ain't going to happen the easy way. We're going to stop spending because we're not going to be able to borrow anymore. It's like your friend, you know he should stop drinking, but he's only going to stop drinking because he's going to die. All right? Not because he's going to go to AA and turn his life around and find God and go on the straight and narrow. I mean, that's your hope for him. But the chances of him doing it are real small. All right? Now, Pete Peterson, I never expected to find Mr. Peterson at the core of 9/11. I knew him as a fiscal conservative. I knew him as a wealthy man. I knew him as being a highly successful person who had made a phone call to to the guy who interviewed me named Chuck Harder. In the last month, I found out that he was chairman of the very branch involved in the financial shenanigans around 9/11 that the Wall Street Journal had even written an article pointing out as being suspicious. All right? That's why, in the beginning of this, I said the name of this program is All Roads Lead to the Federal Reserve and 9/11. Now, you now know as much as I know. All right? Which is a lot more than I knew 1987 when Norman told me that rather extraordinary story under the most extraordinary of circumstances. A story I'm sure that Norman told very few other people, and if he did tell them or alluded to it, he didn't tell them in the detail Norman told me. I spent days walking around the track with Norman, going over the minutiae, the details about the story that he told me, trying to get my fix on why this happened, why that happened, why this happened. That was a story that led me ultimately to the name of Bruce Rappaport, a name that I didn't even put in the first edition of my book, Light in a Dark Place. All right? In the second edition that I just released last month, that name is in there in the last part of the book because I discovered that name ties directly into the events which none of us really understand about 9/11. There are hints that are so glaring, however, that they do call for an investigation. All right? This is our country. Or at least we think it is. All right? But the truth of the matter is, it's our country in the same way that being on a bus, you can refer to your friends, say, oh, that's my bus. All right? The truth is, that's not your bus. All right? The truth is, when you tell your friends, that's my bus, you're referring it to as, that's the bus that which you're going to have to get on. You have a ticket to a seat, and it's going to take you to the next city. And we've just taken you to that bus and packed you a lunch because we know you're going to go on that bus to the next city. We know that you don't mean, that's my bus. We know that you have no ownership interest in Greyhound. We know that you don't know the owner, and we know you're not the driver. You are a passenger on that bus. So when we say, this is your country, or this is my country, I mean it in that respect. I mean it in the respect that we are on in that country. Now, it is more correctly to say to Pete Peterson, oh, that's his bus, or that's his country. When Pete Peterson puts his hand over his heart and pledges allegiance to the flag of the United States, he probably has a deeper connection to that flag than you or I do. Or if he doesn't, he has a deeper reason to be appreciative than you or I do. All right? He sits at the very apex of power. Now, we all know that something happened on that day that nobody ever really told us why. Things happened in front of our face. Buildings went down like a demolition. And people go up and Google a demolition. It's on the web. Go Google demolition. And you'll see buildings. Boom, boom, boom. And then Google 9/11 demolition and you'll see pictures. Same pattern. Okay? And if it didn't strike you as strange how two buildings built to withstand the impact of airlines actually did go down after they were hit by airlines, because it's plausible anything can happen, then it is even more implausible that a building a quarter mile away, building number 7, went down and wasn't even hit by an airplane. Building number 7 wasn't even hit by an airplane, and it had the same boom, 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 and went down like a building being demolished. Now, if either of those two things haven't made you wonder if somebody wasn't telling you something or if somebody wasn't hiding something, maybe this will. I found out in the last month that building number 7 had been bought by Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Centers that did collapse, including Building 7. That he had bought Building 7 in the months before 9/11, all right? And he tripled insurance payouts on this. Triple. You know what the premium is for an insurance payout? I want to tell you something. Insurance costs a lot of money, especially on a building like the World Trade Centers. Just having insurance on it is all that's required. If you're going to put double indemnity on it, well, you're going to pay a lot more money than the first one. And if you're going to ask for triple coverage, well, you must know something that nobody else does to pay that kind of money. And that's the kind of insurance bet Larry Silverstein had on his properties in the World Trade Center. But I want to tell you something else about building number 7. I recently found out that Larry Silverstein bought building number 7 with funds from Blackstone Partners, Peter G. Peterson's investment group. So Peter G. Peterson was not only chairman of the New York Fed at the time of 9/11, his company had bankrolled the purchase of building number 7, which was triply insured against damage. Now, the courts threw out the triple insurance. I don't know what grounds. I mean, I'm sure he made every one of his payments, all right, on that. I'm sure he could have squawked and said, hey, I paid this money. There it is. It said triple insurance, triple indemnity. I'm entitled to it. But even the courts couldn't find it in their digestive tract to give Larry Silverstein triple the amount of damages, even though he had paid good money for it, or what we believe to be as good money. Money which had been advanced on the purchase of that building by Peter G. Peterson, who was not only chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank at the center of those events around 9/11, but financed Larry Silverstein's purchase of building number 7. That's the third coincidence. We live in a world of coincidences, all right? And we live in a world of facts that most of us don't jive with, all right? And this program is going to air after 9/11. And I'm sure that on that date, the media is going to bring out the usual flags, the usual somber tone commentators, the usual memories of that dastardly day when blood was shed as never before on American soil. And none of them are going to ask the questions that need to be asked. And there's a reason for it. The 1%, I don't know who did it. I mean, I think I have a little more of a bigger handle on it than I certainly did before. And those of you who have listened to this program, who managed to stick it through, I don't know, maybe now you know as much as I do. All right? But what you do know is this. The Republic is in trouble. The United States is in danger as never before. In the last month, I don't know the man's name, it may be Michael Dinn, I'm not sure at all. But he was a NSA official, National Security Agency. And he recently went public. And he said that the National Security Agency had, after 9/11, started a widespread surveillance program on U.S. citizens. That took a lot of guts. All right? That took a lot of guts. I know that there are Americans of vast courage out there. But I know that most Americans are too afraid to ask questions because they're even more afraid of the answers. Americans are more content to stand with their hands over their heart, send their children into battle in foreign lands, than to ask questions of their elected representatives of what happened on that day. The 9/11 Commission was just as stacked and rigged as the Warren investigation into the death of John F. Kennedy. These are dark days. No less darker than the days of the American Revolution in 1776. When a handful of farmers, businessmen, workers took up arms against the most powerful nation on the planet, England, bet their lives against the possibility, on the possibility of freedom, against all odds, to bring about that extraordinary revolution, which resulted in that extraordinary document, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the United States. But that was a long, long time ago. 1776. This is 2012. And I am asking you to think about that time and what was at stake, and ask yourself the question, is it as much stake, is as much stake today as was then? And then I want you to ask yourself the next question. What might I do about it? What can I do about it? Because if you don't ask that question, if you don't talk to people, if you don't bring this situation up that the powers that be do not want to be looked at, discussed, or even uncovered, America as an experiment, America as a bastion of freedom, will be over. Because America exists only because of you, of Americans. That's all. And if you don't want freedom, if you aren't willing to risk asking a question because you are afraid of the answer, you don't deserve the freedoms that this country was fought for.